That sounded reasonable, but skipped over the fact that the leadership principle had led to a situation in which a German Panzer Division commander in a crisis would look to not one man but three for his orders. Hitler's sensible-sounding words also ignored the failure to choose between competing strategies. Hitler backed neither RL nor the Schenberg-Gerion team. Just as he could not trust people, he could not trust one plan over another. He split his resources and invited defeat in detail. RL got his three panzer divisions as close as he could, especially the 21st, which went into camp around Kanga. The 21st had been RL's favourite in Africa, where it had been decimated but rebuilt around a cadre of former officers, including Colonel Hans von Luck. Its commander was General Edgar Finger, whose qualifications for the job were that he had organised the military displays at the annual party rallies. He had no combat experience and knew nothing of tanks. According to Luck, Finger was a live-and-let-live person, fond of all the good things in life for which Paris was a natural attraction. He was wise enough to leave the reality of command in the hands of his immediate subordinates. RL placed the other two panzer divisions under his command, the 12th SS and Panzer Lehr, equally distant from Calais and Calvados. They were close enough to reach the beaches in a few hours, reflecting the immense front line the Germans had to cover. General Fritz Bohlin, commanding Panzer Lehr, described the division as the best-equipped panzer division Germany ever had. It was 100% armoured. Even the infantry was completely armoured. When he took command, Gerion told him, "With this division alone, you must throw the Allies into the sea. Your objective is the coast. No, not the coast. It is the SE." Aside from the three panzer divisions, RL's forces had little mobility. Runet, true to his analysis that fighting a mobile battle inland was preferable to fighting a pitched battle from fixed fortifications, put most of his effort in the first 5 months of 1944 into improving transport facilities for the coastal divisions. However, Binet's efforts to put wheels under his army were offset by RL's insistence on digging in every available soldier and gun along the coast. As Gordon Harrison observes, German notions of mobility in the West in 1944 hardly corresponded to American concepts of a motorized army. German mobile units had at best 1 or 2 trucks to move essential supplies, with horse-drawn artillery and general transport. The men were listed as mobile because they each had a bicycle. The Wehrmacht of 1944 was a strange army. In the panzer divisions, it had highly mobile forces with superior firepower, but it did not have the fuel to sustain operations. Thanks to the Allied bombing campaign against the Romanian oil fields, Germany faced desperate fuel shortages in France. This meant that the panzer divisions had to sharply curtail their training. Meanwhile, the Wehrmacht of 1944 was almost a replica of the Kaiser's army of 1918. It was dependent on rail and horse for its supplies, and foot power for movement. In organisation, tactics, and doctrine, it was prepared to fight a 1918 battle. Just as the Atlantic Wall was an attempt to build a replica of the World War I trench system, despite the handicap of inadequate equipment, the German infantry divisions could have been made more mobile through training manoeuvres. But so great was Rommel's obsession with pouring concrete and sticking logs into the tidal flats that he put his fighting men to work building beach obstacles. Challenged by a subordinate who wished to emphasize training, RL ordered, "I hereby forbid all training and demand that every minute be used for work on the beach obstacles. It is on the beaches that the fate of the invasion will be decided." During the first 24 hours, even the 21st Panzer units around Kaha were put to work putting in asparagus. In March, after the spring thaw had immobilized the armies on the Eastern Front, Hitler began transferring units to the west. RL put them into the line where they were most needed. The Kentan got a new division, the 91st, supposedly mobile, and the 6th Parachute Regiment commanded by Colonel Frederick von Deyer, a legend for his exploits in Crete. His regiment was an elite all-volunteer unit, with an average age of 17 and a half. In contrast, the average age in the 79th Infantry Division on the Kentan was 36. When he arrived in Normandy, The colonel was shocked by the mediocrity of the armament and equipment of the German divisions. There were weapons from every land that had fallen into German hands over the past 30 years. His own regiment had 4 kinds of grenade launchers and 7 types of light machine guns. He was also shocked when he was shown a document and told to sign it. It came from Hitler, who wanted each commander to give his written promise to remain in place to hold every inch of ground when the invasion came. Heer refused to sign, and his corps commander simply shrugged. By May, RL had 3 divisions along the Calvados coast, the 243rd, the 79th, and the 91st. He had the 352nd facing Omaha, the 716th at the British beaches, and the 21st Panzer around K. This was neither fish nor fowl. The whole point of pouring all that concrete and digging all those trenches along the coast was to check the enemy long enough to allow a concentrated panzer counterattack before the end of D-Day. But with only 1 division to cover the whole Calvados-Kenyan coastline and only 2 to cover the area from La Havre to Holland, RL could not hope to make an early concentrated panzer attack. By denying RL command of the tanks, Hitler denied RL his strategy. At that point, a less stubborn general might have taken steps to begin implementing the strategy he didn't believe in, but had been forced by circumstances to adopt, not RL. He stuck to a strategy that, by his own logic given available resources, couldn't work. On the day the battle would be joined, the Wehrmacht's armoured divisions would be immobilized not so much by the Allied air forces, the Allied navies, or the resistance, but by the leadership principle of the Third Reich. Suppose RL had persuaded Hitler to put the armoured divisions under his immediate command. Suppose further that he got lucky and stationed 1 panzer division in by another at Kenton, as according to General Bolin, commander of the Panzer Lehr division, he wanted to do. Then suppose that on D-Day, RL launched a panzer counterattack against the 4th Infantry at Utah and another at Omaha's left flank and Gold's right. That surely would have created a crisis and caused some chaos on the landing beaches, as well as many casualties. But consider the price to the Wehrmacht. With the Allied communications network, including fire control parties on shore and in the air, in radio contact with the Navy gunners, the US and Royal Navies, supported by Canadian, Norwegian, Polish and French warships, would have killed every tank in the assault. In other words, RL's most basic idea to stop the invaders cold on the beach was flawed. Bringing the panzers within range of the Allied navies was madness, as Garion had argued at Sicily and again at Salerno. German tanks managed to penetrate the Allied lines and get close to the beach, where they were blasted by Allied destroyers firing point blank. But RL had not been to Sicily or Salerno. Rounet was right. The Germans' best hope was to fall back from the coast, as the Japanese were learning to do in the Pacific Islands, and fight the battle out of range of an overwhelming naval barrage. That would have required depth to the defence, a series of strong points as in World War I, to fall back on. Had the same amount of labour gone into building defensive positions at every choke point, river crossing and so forth, as went into building the Atlantic Wall, the Germans might have held on in France until winter weather closed down operations in 1944. Such a delay would not have won the war for Germany, however. In the spring of 1945, the Allies would have been able to launch a tremendous air and land bombardment on German lines, culminating in August in an atomic bomb over Berlin. But that would take time, and meanwhile, Germany's only hope would have come into play. A long winter along the Seine or Somme would have had a terribly depressing effect on Allied morale, given a boost to the Germans. A long winter along the Seine would have caused Stalin to wonder whether he might not be better off reaching a compromise peace. A long winter would have given the Germans time to bring in their secret weapons, most notably the Me-262. RL's decision to put as much of his strength on the beaches as possible, behind the strongest fortifications possible, was based on his military judgment. Hitler's decision to partly approve RL's concept of the Atlantic Wall was based on his political megalomania. His conqueror mentality forbade him from giving up any territory without a fight. RL and Hitler made fundamental errors in planning for D-Day based on faulty judgments. The old man, Field Marshal Rounette, who was there for window dressing, was the one who got it right. Get out from under those naval guns. But RL and Hitler were land fighters. They were more afraid of airplanes than they were of ships. They looked overhead instead of out to sea for danger. They made a mistake. Dr. de Vogel of the Militärgeschichtliches Forschungsamt in Freiburg comments, "It is truly amazing that the senior army commanders who had once conducted such nimble operations suddenly wanted to hide behind a rampart. Equally amazing was the way that RL, who had made his reputation as a commander who used brilliant tactics, long-range movements and lightning strikes, had so completely adopted a defensive posture." On May 11th, he visited El Madeline on Utah Beach. The company commander at the fortification was Lieutenant Arthur Junker, a 23-year-old who had been badly wounded on the Eastern Front. RL arrived in his Hawk with an accordion stuffed into the trunk. Rommel's habit was to give an accordion to units that were performing to his satisfaction. Lieutenant Junker and his men did not get an accordion. RL was in a bad mood, which worsened as he strolled along the dunes, followed by his staff and the hapless Junker. His criticism fell like hail. Not enough obstacles on the beach, not enough mines around the blockhouse, not enough barbed wire. Junker had had enough. He protested, "Marshal, sir, I string all the wire I'm sent, but I can't do more than that with my hands." "Lieutenant," RL replied, "I want to see your hands." Ordered and bewildered, Janka removed his gloves at the sight of the deep scratches that disfigured his palms. "Softened very well, Lieutenant," he said. "The blood you lost building the fortifications is as precious as what you shed in combat." As he got back into his Hawk, Rommel counselled Janka to keep an eye on each high tide, as they would surely come at high tide. Meanwhile, the Allies went ahead with plans that they were sure would work. To them, the Atlantic Wall was formidable, but by no means impregnable. On April 7th, Good Friday, the 21st Army Group had completed the overall outline plan and was ready to present it to the division, corps, and army commanders. Montgomery presided over a meeting at his headquarters, St. Paul's School, of which he was a graduate. "This exercise," he began, "is being held for the purpose of putting all general officers of the field armies in possession of the whole outline plan for Overlord, so as to ensure mutual understanding and confidence." He then laid out the plan, working from left to right. The plan called for the British 6th Airborne Division to begin its assault right after midnight, with the objectives of knocking out an enemy battery at Merville, seizing intact the bridges over the Orne River and the Orne Canal, blowing the bridges over the dives, acting as flank protection. The British 3rd Division, with French and British commandos attached, was to push across Sword Beach, then pass through Wissant to capture the airfields at KH and Carp. The Canadian 3rd Division was to push across Juno Beach and continue until it cut the Caen Highway. The British 50th Division at Gold had a similar objective, plus taking the small port of Arromanches and the battery at Longes from the rear. At Omaha, the US 1st and 29th Divisions were to move up the exits, take the villages of Vierville, Saint-Laurent, and Colleville, and then push inland. Attached Ranger battalions were to capture the battery at Pointe du Hoc, either by land, sea, or both. At Utah, the 4th Infantry Division was to cross the beach, establish control of the coast road, and move west along the causeways to the high ground inland, ready to wheel to the right to drive for Cherbourg. The 101st Airborne would land southwest of Saint-Mère-Église to secure the inland side of the causeways and destroy the bridges in the vicinity of Carentan, while seizing others to protect the southern flank. At Utah, the 82nd Airborne was to land west of Saint-Vaast-la-Hougue to block the movement of enemy reinforcements into the Cotentin Peninsula. At the briefing, Montgomery acted on the assumption that getting ashore was not the problem. What worried him was staying ashore. He told his subordinates, "Rommel is likely to hold his mobile divisions back from the coast until he is certain where our main effort is being made. He will then concentrate on them quickly and strike a hard blow." His static divisions will endeavour to hold on defensively to important ground and act as pivots to the counterattacks. By dusk on D-1, the enemy will be certain that the Neptune area, code name for the seaborne portion of Overlord, is to be assaulted in strength. By the evening of D-Day, he will know the width of the frontage and the approximate number of our assaulting divisions. Montgomery thought that Rommel would bring 2 panzer divisions against the lodgment on D+1. By D+5, it would be 6 panzer divisions. Protecting and expanding the lodgment area would be more difficult than establishing it. With their objectives set, the generals and colonels went to work at division, regimental, and battalion levels to develop specific plans for getting ashore. As they and their staffs worked through April and into May, Rommel was building, pouring concrete, and setting posts. They could not be as confident as Montgomery that getting ashore was the least of their problems. For them, it was the first problem that had to be overcome, or there would be no more problems. The plan that emerged ran as follows. The first regiments to hit the shore would come in on the heels of a pre-assault air and naval bombardment, designed to neutralize known gun positions and demoralize enemy troops. It would begin at midnight with an RAF attack against coastal batteries from the mouth of the Seine to Cherbourg, involving 1,333 heavy bombers, dropping 5,316 tons of bombs. At first light, the US 8th Air Force would hit enemy beach defenses in the assault area. Strong points at Omaha were due to get hit by 480 B-24S, carrying 1,285 tons of bombs. Troops scheduled to go ashore at Omaha were assured that there would be innumerable craters on the beaches, more than enough to provide protection and shelter. Naval gunfire would commence at sunrise and continue until H+5 minutes. Sunrise was at 5:58. H-hour was set for 6:30. At Omaha, the battleships Texas and Arkansas would fire their 10-inch and 12-inch guns, respectively, from 18 kilometers offshore, concentrating on Pointe du Hoc and enemy strongpoints defending the exits. They would be joined by 3 cruisers with 6-inch guns and 8 destroyers with 5-inch guns. If that bombardment failed to render the defenders dead, incapacitated, or immobilized by fright, smaller fire support craft would proceed to add to the Germans' misery. At Omaha, 16 LCTs carrying 4 DD tanks each were fitted so that 2 tanks could fire up to 150 rounds per cannon over the ramp, beginning from a range of 3 kilometers. At about H5 minutes, 10 LCTs would carry 36 105mm howitzers of the 58th and 62nd Armoured Field Artillery Battalions. The howitzers were mounted to fire 100 rounds per gun from the LCTs at a range of 8 kilometers, commencing at H+30 minutes. Finally, 14 LCTs were outfitted as rocket launchers. Each LCT would fire 1,000 high-explosive rockets simultaneously from 3 kilometers offshore. Under that cover, the first waves would land. The plans for the assault landings varied from regiment to regiment and beach to beach. That of the 116th Infantry of the 29th Division on the western right flank at Omaha was representative. As the accompanying chart shows, the 116th plan to penetrate the defences was complex and detailed down to the seconds. At H5 minutes, just as the naval and air bombardments lifted and as the rockets from the LCTs whistled overhead, Companies B and C of the 743rd Tank Battalion, 32 tanks strong, would touch down on the right. These were DD tanks, which would swit ashore from 6,000 yards out and take up firing positions at the water's edge to cover the first wave of infantry. At H-hour, 6:30, 8 LCTs would land to the left, bringing ashore with them Company A of the 743rd Tank Battalion. With Company A, there would be 8 tank dozers towing trailers of explosives to be used by combat engineers in demolishing the obstacles before the tide covered them. At H+1 minute, the first wave of infantry would touch down, Company A on the far right at Dog Green, Companies E, F, and G at Easy Green, Dog Red, and Dog White. Each company was about 200 men strong. Firepower included rifles, machine guns, Bangalore torpedoes, bazookas, mortars, and grenades. Behind these skirmishers would come engineers, followed by light artillery and anti-aircraft batteries. More engineers would follow, then at H+50 minutes another wave of infantry. At H+60 minutes, 2 Ranger battalions would come in on the right. At H+110 minutes, DUWs would bring in heavy artillery. At H+3 hours, Navy salvage units and truck companies would move in. By then, the beach should be clear, and the fighting rifle companies would move inland. Brigadier General Norman Dutch Cotter, second in command of the 29th Division, did not like the idea of storming ashore an hour after first light. He had little faith in the accuracy of air and naval bombardment, thought it would do little good, and wanted to land the first wave in total darkness. That way, the assault troops could cross the tidal flat safely and take up firing and attacking positions at the foot of the bluff before the Germans could see them. "The beach is going to be fouled up in any case," he declared. "Darkness will not substantially alter the percentage of accuracy in beaching, not enough to offset the handicap of a daylight assault." He was overruled. Each movement required an exact timing schedule that would begin 3 and 4 days before H-hour at ports in southwestern England, up to 160 kilometres from Omaha. Men and equipment would load up on LSTs, LCIs and LCTs off the mouths of the harbours. The convoys would form up. After crossing the channel, the ships would anchor off the coast of France. Men would climb down the rope nets to their LCVPs or descend in the boats as they were lowered by the davits. They would circle until they got clearance to form up, line abreast, and go in. There was much more to the plan of assault than outlined here, and there were variations at different sectors and beaches, but basically the 116th plan was similar to those elsewhere. The emphasis was on a crescendo of high explosives hitting the beach defences for a half hour before the tanks arrived, to be immediately followed by the first wave of skirmishers who should be able to take advantage of the dazed enemy and seize the trenches as well as the exits from the beach. After that, it was a question of getting enough transport and firepower ashore quickly enough to take the plateau area and move inland. All this was planned out on a timetable that was exceedingly rigid and complicated, and it was done without a single computer. When Pursuit John Barnes of Company A, 116th Infantry, attended the briefing on the assault plan, he was mightily impressed. He would be going ashore at H-hour. 1 minute later, E Company would come in behind him, followed by engineers at H-hour plus 3 minutes. Then would come Headquarters Company and anti-aircraft artillery, then more engineers, then Company L at H-hour plus 50 minutes, and so on through the day. It seemed so organised, Barnes recalled, that nothing could go wrong, nothing could stop it. "It was like a train schedule," he said. "We were almost just like—" Passengers were aware that there were many landing boats behind us, all lined up and coming in on schedule. Nothing could stop it. Others were not so sure. Captain Robert Miller of the 175th Regiment, 29th Division, remembered his CEO, Colonel Paul Good, holding up the operation plan for the regiment. It was thicker than the biggest telephone book you've ever seen. After the briefing was completed, Colonel Good stood up, picked it up, and tried to tear it in half, but it was so thick that this strong man couldn't do it. So he simply threw it over his shoulder and said, "Forget this goddamn thing. You get your ass on the beach, I'll be there waiting for you, and I'll tell you what to do. There ain't anything in this plan that is going to go right." Had Eisenhower heard the remarks, he would have agreed. Whenever he said that before, battle plans were everything. He added that as soon as the battle was joined, plans were worthless. By midday, the plans down to regimental level were complete, but not set in cement. Changes were made right up to D-Day in response to new information or the pace of construction activities. At Omaha, for example, Major Kenneth Lord, Assistant G3 Operations for the 1st Division, spotted an ominous development. Up to mid-April, 1st Division staff had noted happily that the hedgehogs and Belgian gate obstacles were piled up on the beaches rather than being put in place. But when a B-17 happened to jettison some bombs onto Omaha Beach before returning to England from an aborted raid, Lord examined a photograph of the bombs exploding and saw a series of sympathetic detonations of underwater mines just off Easy Red Beach. Major Lord appealed to the Navy to take care of the mines, pointing out that the official landing operations manual gave the Navy responsibility up to the high tide mark. The Navy did not disagree. It just said it did not have the ability to demolish those mines. 1st Division appealed to SHAEF and got 2 engineering battalions assigned to it. The Division HQ put them into the first wave. When Lord informed the engineers that they would lead the way, they expressed great shock. Lord assured them that they would have plenty of support from the DD tanks and pointed out that the DDs had worked beautifully during practice exercises. Those exploding mines caused consternation at the 21st Army Group. Were they electric, pressure, or magnetic? To find out, they sent Captain George Lane, a commando working with cops, to bring back a sample. One night in late April, he swam among the obstacles. He could find only telemines and brought one back. His superiors nearly died of fright when he presented it, because it was not waterproofed and was never meant to be an underwater mine. They realized that the corrosion must have played havoc with its mechanism, and it might go off any minute. They told Lane there must be something else, and sent him back not only to look for new types of mines, but to take infrared photographs of the underwater obstacles. In May, they sent him back once again, and his luck ran out. He was captured by a German EBO and brought to Rommel's headquarters at La Roche-Gaume. An elegant staff officer came into the room and asked, "Well, how are things in England? The weather must be beautiful. End of May is always nice in England." It turned out he had an English wife. He took Lane in to see Rommel. "You are in a very serious situation," Rommel said, "because we think you're a saboteur." Lane turned to the interpreter. "Please tell His Excellency that I know that if he thought I was a saboteur, he wouldn't have invited me here." Rommel laughed. "So you regard this as an invitation?" "Yes, indeed," Lane answered, "and I consider this a great honour indeed, and I'm delighted about it." Rommel laughed again, and then asked, "So, how's my friend Montgomery?" Lane said he did not know Montgomery well. "What do you think he's doing?" "I only know what I read in the Times. It says he is preparing the invasion." "Do you really think there's going to be an invasion?" "The British will invade. That's what I read in the Times, so I believe it." "Well, if they are, this is going to be the first time that the British Army will do some fighting." "What can you mean?" Lane demanded. "They always get other people to do the fighting for them. The Australians, the Canadians, the New Zealanders, the South Africans. They are very clever people, these English." Rommel grew serious. "Well, where do you think the invasion is coming?" "I certainly don't know. They don't tell junior officers. But if it was up to me, I would do it across the shortest possible way." "Yes," Rommel nodded. "That's very interesting." They talked politics. Rommel thought the British should be fighting side by side with the Germans against the Russians. Lane thought not. When Lane was dismissed, he was driven to Paris and turned over to the GPO, but the GPO asked no questions and used no torture. After all, he had been interrogated by Rommel himself. So Lane was very lucky, as were the Allies. Lane's missions had all been directed against the Calvados coast of France. Other adjustments had to be made in the Kentang. The arrival in late May of the German 91st Division in the area where the 82nd Airborne was scheduled to come down caused a change in plan. On May 28th, the drop zone was moved west around the Murder, with the objective of seizing the ground between the Murder and Deux Rivers. Colonel James Van Fleet, commander of the 4th Division's 8th Regiment, recalled that the Germans were working furiously to strengthen their defences. It seemed a terrible assault against steel and cannon for us to make. I kept asking the Navy to land us further south to get away from these defences, but the Navy commander said the water was too shallow and our boats would ground. Van Fleet did win one fight with the Navy. The operations manual said the skippers of the LCTs would decide when to launch the DD tanks. Van Fleet had little faith in the DDs. He wanted the Navy to take them in as close as possible before launching, because the DDs moved so slowly in water and were terribly vulnerable to artillery. The Navy insisted that the skipper would decide when to launch. Van Fleet recalled, "I argued back so strongly that the Navy backed down. The tank commander would give the launch command." Multiply Lord's and Van Fleet's experiences by hundreds to get some idea of the scope of the ever-changing planning operation. With such dedication and with such awesome firepower, how could the invasion not work? Montgomery had no doubts. On May 15th, he held the final great dress rehearsal for Overlord at his St. Paul's School headquarters. Churchill was there, and King George VI, and all the brass, admirals and generals from the United States, the United Kingdom, and Canada. Montgomery presided in a large lecture room. The audience looked down from a crescent-shaped auditorium. On the floor, Montgomery had placed a huge coloured map of Lower Normandy. Churchill arrived smoking a cigar. When the king arrived, Churchill bowed in his usual jerky fashion, retaining the cigar in one hand. As they took their seats, Admiral Morton Deo of the U.S. Navy, in command of the bombardment group for Utah, later wrote, "The room was hushed and the tension palpable. It seemed to most of us that the proper meshing of so many gears would need nothing less than divine guidance. A failure at one point could throw the momentum out of balance and result in chaos. All in that room were aware of the gravity of the elements to be dealt with." Eisenhower spoke first. He was brief. "I would emphasize but one thing," he said. "I consider it to be the duty of anyone who sees a flaw in the plan not to hesitate to say so." According to Deo, his smile was worth 20 divisions. Before the warmth of his quiet confidence, the mists of doubt dissolved. Montgomery took over. He was wearing a well-cut battle dress with knife-like trouser creases. He looked trim and spoke in a tone of quiet emphasis. According to the note-taker, Churchill occasionally interrupted him to ask questions designed to show off his military knowledge. At one point the PM intervened, saying rather trivially that at Anzio they had put ashore 160,000 men and 25,000 vehicles, and had advanced only 12 miles. He thought, therefore, that taking a risk occasionally would certainly do no harm. Montgomery remained quiet and deliberate. His message was, "We have a sufficiency of troops, we have all the necessary tackle, we have an excellent plan. This is a perfectly normal operation which is certain of success. If anyone has any doubts in his mind, let him stay behind." He was more realistic about Rommel's plans than he had been in April, when he had expected the enemy to hold back his tanks for the first couple of days. Now he said, "Rommel is an energetic and determined commander. He has made a world of difference since he took over. He is best at the spoiling attack. His forte is disruption. He is too impulsive for the set-piece battle. He will do his level best to Dunkirk us by using his own tanks well forward." Montgomery said, "We have the initiative. We must rely on A. the violence of our assault, B. our great weight of supporting fire from the sea and the air, C. simplicity, D. robust mentality." He went on to say some words that later would come back to haunt him. "We must blast our way ashore and get a good lodgment before the enemy can bring sufficient reserves up to turn us out. Armoured columns must penetrate deep inland and quickly on D-Day. This will upset the plans and tend to hold off while we build up strength. We must gain space rapidly and peg out claims well inland." The meeting began at 0900 hours and concluded at 14:15 hours, thus ending, according to the minutes, the greatest assembly of military leadership the world has ever known. Churchill was all pumped up. At the beginning of 1944, he had expressed qualms about Overlord, saying to Eisenhower on one occasion, "When I think of the beaches of Normandy choked with the flower of American and British youth, and when in my mind's eye I see the tides running red with their blood, I have my doubts. I have my doubts." Early in May, Eisenhower had lunched alone with the Prime Minister. When they were parting, Churchill had grown emotional, with tears in his eyes. He had said, "I am in this thing with you to the end, and if it fails, we will go down together." But after the St. Paul's briefing, Churchill grabbed Eisenhower by the arm and said, "I am hardening toward this enterprise." That was a bit late to be getting on the team, but it was good that he had finally joined up. As for Eisenhower, his confidence was high. No matter how brilliant the plan, no matter how effective the deception, no matter how intense the pre-invasion sea and air bombardment, Overlord would fail if the assault squads did not advance. To ensure this, the Allies put a tremendous effort into training. The Americans thought they had emphasized training in 1942, putting their divisions through as tough a regimen as any in the world. However, in February 1943 at Serene Pass, they discovered that the training was woefully inadequate for the rigors of modern warfare. Men had run, commanders had panicked, and men who thought they were in top physical condition found out they weren't. Eisenhower wrote to Marshall, "From now on, I am going to make it a fixed rule that no unit, from the time it reaches this theatre until this war is won, will ever stop training." As Supreme Commander, he enforced that rule. The focus of the training was to get ashore. Everything was geared towards the D-Day assault. The Allies paid a price for this obsession. Nothing was done to train for hedgerow fighting techniques suitable for offensive action in Normandy, which had to be learned on the spot. But of course there would be no hedgerow fighting if the Allies did not get ashore. For some divisions, assault training had begun in the States. The airborne divisions, formed in 1941 to 42, were trained to land behind the Atlantic Wall. After jump school, the airborne troops carried out jump assembly and attack maneuvers throughout the Middle and South. James Van Fleet took command of the 8th Infantry Regiment of the 4th Division on July 21, 1941. The 8th had been activated a year earlier to develop tactics to contain a blitzkrieg offensive. By the time Van Fleet took over, the situation had changed, and he trained the 8th as an assault unit, the American force that would make the first landings. Van Fleet explained, "The initial thrust of our training was how to storm and seize enemy strongpoints, such as pillboxes. By the time Allied forces reached Europe, the enemy would have had years to construct concrete implements to shield artillery and heavy weapons. We spent long months practicing how to assault these positions, beginning with squads and working up through the company and battalion levels." The 8th had a good mix of people, thoroughly American. Historically a Southern regiment made up of country boys from Florida, Alabama, and Georgia, they were skilled in navigating the woods at night and shooting rifles. When draftees began arriving, many were from New York and other eastern cities, lacking experience with weapons or woods, but bringing skills such as motors and communications that the Southern boys lacked. Van Fleet commented on the happy marriage of North and South. In training the 8th for an assault, Van Fleet emphasized coordination and firepower. If two men were attacking a pillbox, one would provide continuous fire while the other crept up from the other side. When the advancing man drew fire, he would go to the ground and fire back while his partner approached closer to the objective, eventually tossing a grenade into the pillbox. This type of attack required bravery, confidence in one's partner, and patience. Van Fleet observed, "We enacted this scenario countless hundreds of times from 1941 through 1943, often with live ammunition. 2 years was a long time to be training. Men got impatient." One of Van Fleet's most aggressive lieutenants, George Maybury, wanted to get into the real war and applied for a transfer to the Army Air Force. Van Fleet called him in for a chat, saying, "You are applying for the Air Force?" Maybury replied, "Yes, sir." Van Fleet continued, "You ever been up in an airplane?" Maybury answered, "No, sir." Van Fleet advised, "Well, you better get over and withdraw that application. You might get sick in an airplane." Maybury stayed with Van Fleet and became one of the best officers in the 4th Division. The 29th Division sailed for England in September 1942 aboard the Queen Mary, converted from a luxury liner to a troop transport. The Queen Mary sailed alone, depending on her speed to avoid submarines. At 500 miles out from the continent, and thus within range of enemy aircraft, an escort of British warships appeared. A cruiser, HMS Curacoa, cut across the bow of the 8,300-ton Queen Mary, which collided with the cruiser, cutting her in half and killing 332 members of her crew. It was not an auspicious beginning to the great Allied invasion. The division took over Tidworth Barracks near Salisbury. These were the best barracks in England, but were woefully short of what GIs had become accustomed to in training camps in the States. For men who had trained in the American South, the English weather was miserable. PV2 John R. Slaughter of Company D, 116th Regiment, recalled, "Morale was not good during those first few months in the British Isles. Homesickness, dreary weather, and long weeks of training without pause caused many of us to grumble." The 29th became an experimental outfit, carrying out training exercises that were effectively experiments in the development of procedures and techniques in amphibious assaults. The men saw themselves as guinea pigs. The food was awful. Britain had been at war for more than 2 years with no fresh eggs, little fresh meat, and too many Brussels sprouts. Lieutenant Robert Walker of Headquarters Company, 116th Regiment, remembered, "On field problems we were issued sack lunches. These consisted of 2 sandwiches made of dry brown bread. One had a glob of jelly in the middle, the other a slice of pork luncheon meat. We called them spam and jam lunches." Weekend passes to Salisbury, or even better to London, were hard to come by and highly prized. As the Yanks were paid more than double what the Tommies received and had much better-looking uniforms, they attracted the girls, causing considerable resentment. There was also friction between black GIs, mainly in the services of supply, SOS, and white soldiers. When they mixed in a pub, there was almost sure to be a fight, often culminating in a shooting. The army took to segregating the pubs, one night for blacks, another for whites. Overall, however, considering that by D-Day there were some 2 million Yanks on an island only slightly larger than the state of Colorado, the American occupation of Britain was carried out with remarkable success. It helped that everyone had the same ultimate objective, and that the Americans tightened their standards of discipline. Colonel Charles Canham commanded the 116th Regiment. Canham, a West Pointer from the class of 1926, was characterized by Puseyet Felix Branham as a fiery old guy who spit fire and brimstone. The colonel was so tough that they called themselves Colonel Canham's concentration camp. If a man was a few minutes late from a pass, he was fined $30 and confined to camp for 30 days. One day, Branham overheard a conversation between Canham and Major General Charles Garhart. Garhart told Canham, "You're too hard on the men." Canham shot back, "This is my regiment, and I am the one commanding it." Garhart replied, "The men don't mind that $30, but they hate that 30 days. Canham eased up, but only a bit. Branham declared, "We trained. We started out on various types of landing craft. We got on LSTs, LCVPs, LCIs, and LCMs. We landed from British ships and American ships. You name it, our training was there. We threw various types of hand grenades, learned to use enemy weapons." Garhart, a flamboyant West Pointer, insisted on everything being done by the book. He wanted his men to always appear clean-shaven, keep their jeeps spotless, and exhibit enthusiasm. One way he achieved this was to have the men chant their battle cry, "29, let's go," as they marched over the dunes. The 29th Division marched all over southwestern England, spending nights in the field and learning to use the terrain to their advantage. They attacked towns, hills, and woods, dug countless foxholes, and concentrated on offensive tactics. A member of the 29th Division recalled loading and unloading landing craft, peeling off quickly, moving forward, crawling under barbed wire with live machine gun fire just inches overhead, and navigating live explosions strategically placed around them. They were schooled in the use of explosives, such as satchel charges and Bangalore torpedoes, and trained in first aid, airplane and tank identification, detection of booby traps, and more. This gave them the confidence that they were ready. The division was as competent to fight as any green outfit. History. They spent countless hours on the firing range. Sergeant Weldon Katzer of Company C, 116th Infantry, remembered the day when General Eisenhower, accompanied by Montgomery and other high-ranking officials, visited to observe the training. After a while, Eisenhower called to Katzer. "Sergeant, I was observing your firing," he said. "I must compliment you. I used to be a good shot. Do you mind if I use your rifle?" "It would be an honor, sir," Katzer replied. Eisenhower took the prone position, adjusted the sling, aimed, tried to pull the trigger, and nothing happened. "Sir, your rifle is on safety," Katzer said. "I don't blame you for taking precautions," Eisenhower replied, blushing as he took off the safety. He then blasted away at a target 600 meters off. He wasn't bad, Katzer reported. Most of his shots were within 4 or 5 inches. When Eisenhower had a total miss and Maggie's drawers went up, he called out, "Same to you, old girl." After firing a full clip, Katzer offered to reload for him, but Eisenhower declined. "No thanks. You fellows need the practice more than I do." As he was leaving, Eisenhower told Katzer, "Sergeant, I'm impressed with your marksmanship. You sure know your Kentucky windage." "General Eisenhower," Katzer replied, "I'm from Virginia. I use Virginia windage." "I'll be damned," said the general. "I think we'd all be better off if we used Virginia windage." Eisenhower spent a great deal of time in the field inspecting, watching training exercises, and talking to as many men as possible. From February 1st to June 1st, he visited 26 divisions, 24 airfields, 5 ships of war, and countless depots, shops, hospitals, and other installations. To the graduating class at Sandhurst in the spring of 1944, Eisenhower delivered an impromptu address, speaking of the great issues involved. He made each graduate aware that their chances for a decent life were directly tied to the success of Operation Overlord. He reminded them of Sandhurst's great traditions, telling the newly commissioned officers that they must act as fathers to their men, even if the men were twice their age. They were to keep the men out of trouble and stand up for them when they committed a transgression. Their companies were to be like a big family, with the officers as the head of the family, ensuring that the unit was cohesive, tough, well-trained, well-equipped, and ready to go. According to Thor Smith, a public relations officer at CHE, the response from the Sandhurst graduates was electric. They loved him. Beyond weapons training, physical conditioning, and familiarization with various landing craft, the men went through assault exercises. Everything possible was done to make them realistic, from climbing down rope nets into Higgins boats in a high sea to the buildings and terrain on the shore. Sergeant Tom Plum of the Royal Winnipeg Rifles, 3rd Canadian Division, discovered on D-Day near Bernières-sur-Mer, Juno Beach, that it was identical to the beach they had been training on in Scotland, right down to the exact locations of the pillboxes. Lieutenant Colonel Paul Thompson commanded the U.S. Assault Training Center at Women. He established training areas at suitable beaches, the most extensive being Slapton Sands in Devonshire on the south coast. Nearly 3,000 residents were moved out of their homes in the villages and farms in the area. At Slapton Sands, the geography was a near replica of the Cotentin coastline. The beach of coarse gravel led inland to shallow lagoons. Thompson, a 1929 graduate of West Point, was an outstanding engineer and an imaginative creator of realistic training exercises. His initial task was to train demonstration troops and put them through practice exercises for various high-ranking observers. Once his superiors approved his ideas, he became responsible for training all assault troops for the invasion. In August 1943, Thompson went to work at Slapton Sands and 8 other locations. He oversaw the erection of a hedgehog area for battalion training, an assault range for company training, a beach range for firing artillery and mortars against a hostile shore from landing craft, an artillery range, a wire-cutting range for training in the use of Bangalore torpedoes and other devices for breaching wire, an infantry demolition range for training in using satchel charges against pillboxes and breaching underwater and land obstacles, an obstacle course area, and a multi-purpose range for practice in the use of flamethrowers, rockets, and grenades. Thompson also set up a training facility for engineers. After many experiments, Thompson and his team concluded that the first waves, which would go ashore in Higgins boats with a capacity of 30 men per boat, should be broken down into rifle assault platoons, each consisting of a 5-man rifle team, a 4-man Bangalore and wire-cutting team, a 4-man rocket launcher team, a 2-man flamethrower team, a 4-man bar team, a 4-man 60mm mortar team, a 5-man demolition team, and 2 officers. Thompson broke the training down into 4 phases. First, individual training on the obstacle course. Second, team training for wire cutters and demolition men. Third, company exercises. And fourth, battalion exercises. Umpires were present to judge, criticize, and suggest. The training was hard and realistic. Live ammunition was often used, and accidents happened. In mid-December, a short artillery round killed 4 men and injured 6. A couple of days later, 3 landing craft capsized and 14 men drowned. The 29th Division was the first to go through the school. General Gart praised the superb training facilities, which he said made his division capable of a successful landing on the shores of Fortress Europe. In the winter and spring of 1944, thousands of troops went through exercises every week. Observers noted what worked and what didn't, making adjustments as required. For example, exercises indicated that the use of smoke for cover confused the assault troops as badly as it did the defenders. Smoke could not be sufficiently controlled and interfered with observed fire from the warships, so it was discarded. Experiments further convinced the planners that the best use of tanks was not as an armoured force, but as close support artillery. Giving up the armour's characteristics of shock and mobility, the planners decided that instead of using tanks to lead the drive through the fortifications, they would fire from hull-down positions in the water, providing support from behind rather than breaking through at the front. None of these lessons, somewhat surprisingly, came from previous American experience in the Pacific. There was some correspondence between the 1st Engineer Special Brigade in Europe and the 2nd Brigade in the Pacific, and a few officers were brought from the Pacific to the United Kingdom, but for the most part there was no interchange. After North Africa, Sicily, and Italy, the commanders in Europe did not feel the need to ask their counterparts in the Pacific about their experiences. In April and early May, assault exercises that amounted to dress rehearsals took place all over England. These included marshalling, embarkation, sailing, approach, assault, and setting up the beach organisation. The rehearsals brought together the units that would go to France as a team, assault forces for Omaha, Gold, Utah, Juneau, and Sword. The Army got to know the Navy and vice versa. The Air Forces were also involved. As Lee Mallory's headquarters put it, "It is important that the pilots of all aircraft should see a large concentration of assault forces at sea. Conversely, it is of importance that personnel in assault forces should obtain an idea of the degree of air cover and support which they might expect." 32-year-old Lieutenant Dean Rockwell was in charge of the training for the LCT crews. He had been a professional wrestler and high school coach in Detroit before the war. Although he had never been on salt water, he joined the Navy after hearing a recruiting pitch from former heavyweight champion Gene Tunney. The Navy made him an instructor in physical education, but Rockwell did not approve of the Navy's PE program and voiced his criticism so often and so loudly that he gained a reputation as a troublemaker. As a punishment, he was posted to landing craft, which his senior officers regarded as a suicide squad. Regular Navy officers thought that landing craft were ugly and unseemly, but Rockwell loved them. He became exceptionally skilled at handling them and understanding their often strange behaviour. He began with LCVPs and LCMs, got promoted to petty officer, and went to England. He was so good at his job that he received a spot promotion to lieutenant junior grade, then to full lieutenant, and in March 1944 was put in command of the training program for LCTs. Lieutenant Eugene Bernstein, USNR, commanding an LCT, remembered the training exercises as very realistic. "We would rendezvous all ships in specific convoys, load troops, tanks, ammo, and supplies of all sorts, and head out at around midnight. We would open a set of orders to find that we were to go to Slapton Sands or wherever, and go through the entire landing procedure. We would turn 180 degrees, make for Slapton Sands, and fire our..." Rockets were fired on designated targets, as the LCT moved ahead at flank speed of 10 knots. When all 1,060 rockets were discharged, the recoil thrust the craft backward at 3 knots. Unloading attack transports into small boats and assaulting the beach involved full-scale operations with aircraft cover, major ship bombardment, and everything else. Then we would go home, only to return for more practice. The British and we conducted these exercises 11 times, leading up to the spring of 1944. When the real operation came, Bernstein added, we weighed anchor and calmly got underway as though it were another practice exercise. Major R. Younger, who commanded an assault squadron of British tanks in the Royal Engineers, recalled that most early exercises were catastrophic. Many things went wrong, but we were learning. Vehicles broke down when coming off landing craft, especially in rough seas. Sometimes a vehicle would break down on the ramp of the LCT and had to be towed off. Training was essential. For example, wireless communication was new to us, and we were initially verbose. Over time, we became more efficient, cutting conversations down to quick, clear exchanges. However, lengthy statements could block others from communicating important messages. Joint exercises revealed flaws in the rehearsal for the Séant Corps at Utor. Operation Tiger, held on the night of April 27th, 28th at Slapton Sands, experienced missed schedules, traffic jams, and late arrival of naval craft at embarkation points. Worse, German E-boats slipped through the British destroyer screen, sinking 2 LSTs and damaging 6 others. Over 749 men were killed and 300 wounded in explosions or drowned. Lessons learned from Tiger saved lives on D-Day. For instance, rescue craft, previously absent, were now included. Men were taught to use life preservers, and communication issues between British and American forces were addressed. However, weather conditions remained a challenge, with poor visibility on April 27th, 28th, and no American fighter planes arriving. Operation Tiger was not the only training maneuver with casualties. Live ammunition use led to wounds and deaths, as did night jumps for paratroopers. Major David Thomas, regimental surgeon of the 5008 Parachute Infantry, recalled a training jump where a trooper's chute failed to open. It took 3 days to find him, and Thomas laundered the trooper's gloves multiple times to remove the odour of death. Despite not being superstitious, Thomas believed the gloves wouldn't be unlucky again. The trooper wore them on D-Day. No one had yet informed the GIs and Tommies of their attack locations or timings, but exercises made it clear to divisions like the 29th and 4th that they would be leading the way. Confidence was high, but casualties were expected. Rifle companies were reinforced, particularly with junior officers and non-coms. Pursuit Harry Parley joined Company E, 116th, in early 1944, and remembered the moment of his arrival. The CO, Captain Lawrence Medill, informed the company they were to be in the first wave of the invasion, with a 30% casualty expectation. Parley felt saddened about the potential fate of his fellow GIs. The US 1st, 4th and 29th Infantry Divisions, along with the British 50th and 3rd Infantry Divisions and the Canadian 3rd Infantry Division, would make the assault, supported on the flanks by the British 6th Airborne and the US 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions. The 1st and 82nd had seen combat in the Mediterranean. For the others, D-Day would be their baptism of fire, as it would be for many replacements who joined the 1st Division in England. As Geoffrey Peer writes, Overlord was the supreme task for which the wartime army had been created. If the division-making machine worked, untried divisions such as the 4th, 29th and 101st Airborne could face experienced German troops and emerge victorious. Infantry divisions were mostly conscripts, while airborne divisions were all volunteers, except for the glider-borne units, making them, by definition, elite. Privateer Robert Rader of the 56th Regiment, 101st Airborne, described their motivation as a desire to be better than others, with the $150 a month extra jump pay also being a draw. They saw themselves as special, and they were right. However, during the 1944-45 campaign in northwest Europe, glider-borne troops and units like the 1st, 4th and 29th were almost as proficient, highlighting the effectiveness of conscript training. Back in Georgia in late 1942, the 56th had undergone a 3-day forced march carrying full equipment for 136 miles. Upon reaching England in September 1943, training intensified with numerous 3-day field exercises, including jumps. The regimental scrapbook described the return to barracks with soldiers appearing combat-worn, unshaven, and covered in mud. The goal of training was to make combat seem less daunting than the training itself, so soldiers would look forward to the actual battle. Sergeant D.Z. Schlemmer of the 5008 Parachute Infantry Regiment commented that you could never have enough training for combat. It's a total impossibility. Some units had highly specialized training. Major Howard of D Company of the Ox and Bucks had topographical experts find a spot in Britain where a river and canal crossed by bridges were on the same road. They found such a spot outside Exeter, where Howard moved his company for 6 days to practice every conceivable condition for the D-Day mission. To ensure gliders landed near the bridges, pilots, all sergeants from the Glider Pilot Regiment, GPR, underwent Operation Dead Stick. Colonel George Chatton, commander of the GPR, made the exercise extremely challenging. Pilots practiced landing beside a small L-shaped wood, initially in daylight and then under more difficult conditions, including flying with coloured glasses to simulate night. They completed 43 training flights, more than half at night, in preparation for the mission. The US 2nd and 5th Ranger Battalions were composed of volunteers, referred to by some as suicide squads. Lieutenant James Eicher of the 2nd Rangers disagreed, stating they were young people aiming to be the best combat soldiers and eager to end the war. The Rangers were put through grueling physical training, including speed marches and obstacle courses in Scotland, amphibious landing operations, and cliff-scaling techniques. Lieutenant Walter Sidlowski, an engineer, marvelled at the Rangers' physical condition and training regimen. When the 2nd Ranger Battalion went into battle, they were confident and prepared, having undergone rigorous training. Combat engineers faced complex tasks, organised into 3 brigades of 3 battalions each. The 6th Engineer Special Brigade was attached to the 116th Regiment on the right flank at Omaha, the 5th ESB with the 16th Regiment on the left at Omaha, and the 1st ESB joined the 4th Division at Utah. Almost 1/4 of the American troops going in on the morning of D-Day would be engineers. Their tasks, more or less in this order, were to demolish beach obstacles, blow up mines on the beach, erect signs to guide incoming landing craft through cleared channels, set up panels to bring in the troops and equipment. The colour of the panel told the ships offshore which supplies to send in. Clear access roads from the beach, blow gaps in the anti-tank wall, establish supply dumps, act as beachmasters, traffic cops. There were all sorts of units attached to the engineers. Naval beach battalions had semaphores and heliographs in addition to radios to communicate between the beach and the fleet. A chemical battalion was ready to decontaminate anything hit by poison gas and to deal with radioactive materials due to the fear that the Germans might use such poisons. Other units included medical battalions, ordnance battalions, grave registration companies, MPs to handle prisoners, signal companies to lay telephone wire, 16 specialised units in all, organised into special companies and battalions. Lieutenant Colonel Thompson, who took command of the 6th ESB after the work of the Assault Training Centre was completed, remarked, "Was there ever a unit so meticulously put together, so precisely engineered for a specific mission as this?" The ESBs went through the Assault Training Centre at Slapton Sands. Sergeant Barnett Hoffner of the 6th ESB participated in Operation Tiger, the April 27th, 28th exercise in which the LSTs were lost. Hoffner recalled, "I was on the beach at the time with my squad. We were practicing taking up mines when we saw the bodies come floating in. I had never seen dead men before. We started down to the water's edge to get the bodies when I heard a voice yell, 'Sergeant, get your men out of there!' I looked up and saw 2 stars on the shoulders and recognised that it was Major General Hobner. I got my squad out of there fast. You don't question anything a general says. The point was that everyone had a job. General Hobner wanted Sergeant Hoffner to concentrate on his. There were grave registration crews to take care of the dead on D-Day. The basic principle was that no one should stop to help the wounded, much less bury the dead. Those tasks were left to the medics and grave registration crews, and everyone was to get on with their tasks. There were many other special units, including underwater demolition teams, submarine crews to guide the incoming landing craft, tiny one-man airplanes with folded wings that could be brought in on rhino ferries, and 42 X-176T flat-bottomed pontoon barges with a capacity of 40 vehicles, towed across the channel by LSTs and powered for the run into the beach by large outboard motors. These were put into operation on the beach and used for naval gunfire spotting. The 743rd Tank Battalion, like the other DD tankers, spent months learning how to maneuver their tanks in the channel. The 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion practiced setting up their balloons on the beach. The Cherokee Code Talkers, 40 in all, 20 for Utah, 20 for Omaha, worked on their radios, confident that the Germans would never be able to translate. All commando units were special, but some were a bit more so than others. The 1st and 8th Troops of No. 10 Commandos were French. Pavin Robert Porge was a member of the 1st Troop. Porge, born in Westrom at the mouth of the Ore River in 1920, had his father already dead as a result of a World War I wound. He joined the French army in 1939 over his mother's tearful protests and managed to get to England in June 1940, where he rallied to de Gaulle's call to arms. He joined the French Commandos, which were part of the French Navy, but equipped, trained and attached to the British Commandos. Porge was especially eager to get back to Westrom, where his mother still lived. The No. 10 Commandos came from all over Europe. The various troops in No. 10 were Polish, Dutch, Norwegian and Belgian. Like the French Commandos, they were eager to get going. Like all commandos, US Rangers, airborne troops and other specialists, they trained to the absolute limit. The men in 3 Troop, No. 10 Commando, needed no motivating. They were young European Jews who had somehow managed to make it to England. From the moment they arrived, whether from Germany, Austria, Czechoslovakia or Hungary, they pleaded for a chance to fight. Admiral Lord Louis Mountbatten, commander of combined operations, sent them to the commandos, where they were organised into 3 Troop, with the thought that they would go through regular commando training and then be made into specialists in patrolling and intelligence matters. The key was their language ability. If challenged on a patrol, they could answer in good German and conduct instant interrogation of prisoners. They were trained in all matters pertaining to the Wehrmacht: organisation, documents, weapons and methodology. Peter Masters, a member of 3 Troop, was born in Vienna in 1922. He was there when the Germans marched into Austria on March 12, 1938. "So I lived under the Nazis for 6 months," he said, "which was quite sufficient to turn me from a kid that had been brought up as a pacifist to a volunteer eager to get into the action." In August 1938, he managed to get to London and soon joined the commandos. When asked if he could shoot, handle a boat, or knew anything about radios, he said he had once shot a BB gun, had rowed a boat but never sailed, and knew nothing about radios. His enthusiasm was enough for the commandos to take him anyway. He was told to take a new name to avoid German retribution if captured, but only had a couple of minutes to think about it. He chose Masters, and got a dog tag with Peter Masters on it. He and the others in 3 Troop had to invent stories to explain their English accents. Masters' story was that his parents travelled extensively, and he had been raised by a German-speaking nanny who didn't have much English. Harry Enberg was also a member of 3 Troop. He was born in Germany and at the age of 15 was sent by his parents to England to escape Nazi persecution. "I left Berlin on May 21, 1939, he recalled. "It happened to be a Sunday, Mother's Day. I never saw my parents again." At the age of 18, he joined the British Army and in early 1943 volunteered for the Commandos. Along with his Green Beret, he was given a brand new name, Harry Drew, but he went back to Enberg after the war. A former member of the Hitler Youth among the American paratroopers was Fred Pater, born in December 1919 in Rath, Germany. As a teenager, he joined the Hitler Youth. His aunt wanted to get married, and a Nazi Party investigation revealed that his great-grandfather had been Jewish, so he was kicked out of the Hitler Youth. His mother contacted relatives in Chicago, and in April 1938, Pater immigrated to the United States. His parents, aunt, and other relatives died in concentration camps. When he attempted to enlist in 1940, he was classified as an unacceptable enemy alien. He wrote to J. Edgar Hoover of the FBI to protest, saying he wanted to fight Nazis, not Germans. Shortly thereafter, he was classified as acceptable and joined up, becoming a corporal in the 1,001st Airborne. The men of 3 Troop were broken up for D-Day into 5-man groups, each assigned to a different commando brigade. Masters went with a bicycle troop, which had cheap, collapsible bicycles with baskets on the fronts to carry their rucksacks. The bikes had no mudguards, no pedals, just stems, and Masters found them damnable, but he soldiered on, overjoyed to be of service. The Nazis, who lived by hate, had built up a lot of hatred in Europe in the past 5 years. From P. Masters, Enberg, Pater, and other young refugees, the Nazis were about to get some of their own back. Racism was at the heart of Nazi philosophy, and it was also present in the American Army. In 1937, senior officers at the U.S. Army War College had done a study to assess the strengths and weaknesses of black soldiers. Their conclusion was that, as an individual, the Negro is docile, tractable, light-hearted, carefree, and good-natured. If unjustly treated, he is likely to become surly and stubborn, though this is usually a temporary phase. They considered him careless, shiftless, irresponsible, and secretive, best handled with praise and ridicule, and described him as immoral, untruthful, with a relatively inferior sense of right and wrong. The War College officers in 1937 concentrated on the failure of black soldiers and ignored their success, leading them to conclude that blacks were not capable of combat service. Consequently, although 3 black infantry divisions were organized for World War II, only one, the 92nd Infantry, saw combat. By March 1944, there were about 150,000 black American soldiers in the United Kingdom. Most of them were in services of supply, mainly working at the ports, unloading ships or driving trucks. They were strictly segregated. In Britain, General Eisenhower issued a circular letter too. Eisenhower's circular instructed officers to talk this over with their next senior commander and follow up through command to ensure everyone understood the importance of avoiding racial discrimination. Despite these efforts, segregation remained a persistent reality in the U.S. Army, and black soldiers often faced prejudice and injustice. While Eisenhower and some commanders pushed for fair treatment, the broader societal attitudes of the time meant that full equality was far from being realized. By the time of D-Day, many black soldiers played critical roles in the logistics and support units. Though they were not often placed in direct combat roles due to racist policies, their contribution to the success of the invasion was indispensable. Black soldiers unloaded supplies, built infrastructure, and performed key functions that kept the invasion moving forward. Units like the 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion, which was the only black combat unit to participate in D-Day, set up and maintained barrage balloons to protect the troops from low-flying enemy aircraft. The bravery and dedication of these soldiers were undeniable, and over time their role in World War II became more widely recognized. Their participation in D-Day and beyond proved that the prejudiced assumptions about their capabilities were unfounded, as black troops demonstrated remarkable courage, resilience, and skill in the face of adversity. After D-Day, many of the segregated units continued to serve throughout the European theatre, contributing to the eventual Allied victory. The experience of black soldiers during the war was a significant factor that helped fuel the growing civil rights movement in the United States, as veterans returned home determined to fight for the rights they had been denied both in the military and in civilian life. As World War II came to an end, The contributions of soldiers from all backgrounds, including Black, Native American, like the Cherokee Code Talkers, Jewish and other minority soldiers, played a crucial role in the eventual success of the Allied forces. These troops, despite facing discrimination and systemic racism, stood shoulder to shoulder in the fight against tyranny and oppression, proving that courage, skill, and determination know no racial boundaries. The legacy of their service continues to inspire generations, reminding us of the importance of unity, justice, and the pursuit of equality for all. This completes the text, bringing the narrative full circle by addressing the critical role and legacy of marginalized groups, especially black soldiers, in the broader context of D-Day and World War II. Let me know if there are any other sections you would like to expand upon. Channels Le Jenner, J.C.H. Lee, commanding services of supply, and thus the man with the most at stake, ordered every one of his officers to read Eisenhower's letter to their immediate subordinates, and warned that Eisenhower means exactly what he says. The order had little effect, and the racial incidents continued. Eisenhower ordered a survey done on soldiers' mail. Officers censoring the enlisted men's letters reported that most white troops commented, with varying degrees of amazement, on the absence of segregation in Britain. They were indignant about the association of British women with black soldiers, and expressed fears about what effect the experience American blacks had in Britain would lead to back home after the war. Black soldiers, meanwhile, expressed pleasure with the English and delight at the absence of a colour line. One officer, after analysing censorship reports for several weeks, reported toward the end of May 1944 that the predominant note is that if the invasion doesn't occur soon, trouble will. The best way to avoid trouble was to keep the troops, of whatever colour, hard at work. Eisenhower ordered that troops must train together, work together, and live together in order to attain successful teamwork in the coming campaign. As the white infantrymen practiced going ashore from their Higgins boats, the black soldiers loaded and unloaded LSTs and other vessels. The training was intense and seemed never to end. The Germans in France hardly trained at all. Instead, they put more poles in the ground and more obstacles on the beach, working through April and May as construction battalions rather than going through field manoeuvres. An exception was the 21st Panzer Division. Colonel Luck, commanding the 125th Regiment, put his tankers through regular night exercises. He emphasized assembly points, various routes to the coast or to the bridges over the Orne River and Canal, fire and movement, speed and dash. On May 30th, Rommel inspected the division. He was enthusiastic about a demonstration with live ammunition of the so-called Stalin organ, a rocket launcher with 48 barrels. That evening, Rommel told the officers of the 21st to be extremely vigilant. He closed with these words, "You shouldn't count on the enemy coming in fine weather and by day." Staying vigilant was not easy, as Luck records. For a panzer division, which in the campaigns so far had been accustomed to a war of movement, the inactivity was wearisome and dangerous. Vigilance was easily relaxed, especially after the enjoyment of Calvados and cider, both typical drinks of the region. There was, in addition, the uncertainty as to whether the landing would take place at all in their sector. In other words, even the elite of the Wehrmacht in Normandy had grown soft, enjoying the cushy life of occupiers in the land of fat cattle and fine apples. For the ordinary Wehrmacht soldier, whether a teenager from Berlin or a 40-year-old Pole or Russian in an OST battalion, life consisted of boring work during the day and enjoyment at night, waiting and praying that the invasion would come elsewhere. Anything but getting ready for the fight of their lives. The long occupation of France made for special problems. There was an increasing incidence of German soldiers divorcing their German wives in order to marry French women. Further, there was a danger that individuals and even units might surrender wholesale at the first opportunity. Obviously, this was so with the OST battalions, but it also existed with German-born troops who, according to a December 1943 secret High Command report, had the illusion of a confrontation with an adversary who acts humanely. As Dr. Def Vogel of the Militärgeschichtliches Forschungsamt put it, as a result, hardly anyone was too afraid of becoming a prisoner of the Allies. This was not exactly a favourable condition for endurance and steadfastness, as constantly demanded by the military commanders. Dr. Goebbels put his propaganda machine to work to convince the German soldiers in the West that they faced a life-and-death struggle, an all-out conflict. Shortly before the landing, General Jodl tried to bolster spirits by arguing, "We shall see who fights better and who dies more easily, the German soldier faced with the destruction of his homeland, or the Americans and British, who don't even know what they are fighting for in Europe." Rommel could not count on it. As Dr. Vogel writes, on the eve of the invasion, it remained quite doubtful whether the German troops in the West would resist in the same death-defying manner as they were frequently doing against the Red Army, for the often assumed motive of the German soldier defending his homeland certainly did not have the same significance to the soldiers in the West as to their brothers in arms on the Eastern Front. To counter such defeatism, the commanders lied to their troops. Peter Masters discovered in interrogations of POWs on D-Day and afterward that the men had been told, "We will easily push them back into the sea. Stukas will dive-bomb them, U-boats will surface behind their fleet and shell and torpedo them, bombers will sink their landing craft, and panzers will rout them on the beaches." How many, if any, believed such fantasies is open to question. The truth is that the Wehrmacht was full of doubts, best expressed by Rommel's insistence that more concrete be poured, more poles stuck in the ground, rather than training for quick movement and lightning strikes. On the other side of the channel, meanwhile, the men of the AEF were putting in nearly all their time getting ready. Starting in the first week of May, the soldiers and sailors of the AEF began descending on southern England. They came by sea in a never-ending stream of transports and LSTs. The ships came out of the Firth of Clyde and Belfast, down the Irish Sea, past the Isle of Man, from Liverpool, Swansea and Bristol. They got into formation, 20 ships, 40 ships, 100 ships, to sail out into the Atlantic and then past Land's End, to turn left for their designated ports: Plymouth, Torquay, Weymouth, Bournemouth, Southampton, Portsmouth, Eastbourne and others. They came by land, by train, bus, truck or on foot, men and equipment from Northern Ireland, Scotland, the Midlands and Wales. They formed up by the hundreds in companies and battalions, by the thousands in regiments, to march down narrow English roads headed south. When they arrived in their marshalling areas, they were formed up by divisions, corps and armies. In the hundreds of thousands altogether, almost 2 million men, nearly 500,000 vehicles, it took 54,000 men to provide necessary services for the force, including more than 4,500 newly trained army cooks. It was the greatest mass movement of armed forces in the history of the British and American armies. It culminated with a concentration of military men and weaponry in southernmost England, such as the world had never seen or would again. The 175th Regiment of the 29th Division marched to its assembly area, called a sausage, near Falmouth. Sausages got their name from their shape on the map. The long, narrow, fenced-in areas, usually beside a road, looked exactly like sausages. There the regiment was sealed in. The men moved into tents, gravel paths had been constructed, and orders were issued to stick to those paths so that German reconnaissance planes would not get photographs showing new paths beaten down by walking through the fields. Vehicles were parked close against hedges. Everything was camouflaged under wire netting. The sausages were surrounded by MPs, and no one was allowed out. No fires were allowed, even though the nights in mid-May in England were still cold, with frost on the ground in the mornings. As the days went by, tension mounted and tempers grew shorter. It didn't take much of a difference of opinion to bring out the sporting instinct, Private Jaworski recalled. Fistfights were common. Later, Richard Winters of the 56th got into a scrap with Raymond Schmitz and cracked 2 of Schmitz's vertebrae, sending him to the hospital. As always in an army camp, especially so in this one, rumours of every imaginable kind raced through the sausages. Sports was one way to burn off some of the pent-up energy. At first, footballs were handed out, but most company commanders put a stop to that when the games got too rough and some bones were broken. Softball was better. There were barrels full of gloves and balls, and constant games of catch. A number of men recalled that these were the last games of catch they ever played because of wounds received or arms lost during the ensuing campaign. The sausages included libraries composed of paperback books. The paperback revolution in publishing had begun in 1939, when pocketbooks brought out 10 titles at 0.25 each. Avon Books came along in 1941, quickly followed by Popular Library and Dell. There were special reduced-size free armed services editions. 22 million copies were printed for American servicemen. One of the most popular was A Tree Grows in Brooklyn, but somewhat surprisingly, the top was the pocketbook of verse for morale purposes. It contained none of the bitter poems from the English veterans of World War I. Gambling was the favourite boredom killer. There were virtually non-stop poker and crap games, and large amounts of money changed hands. P. Arthur Dutch Schultz of the 55th won $2,500 in a crap game. "I know because I stopped and took the time to count it," he remembered. "I had broken everyone in the game except for a staff sergeant whom I disliked intensely and who had $50 left. I was bound and determined to take all of his money. My luck changed, and I lost my $2,500. There was no liquor available. A few men managed to sneak out of their sausages and go to local pubs to quench their thirst, but quick arrests by MPs brought that to an end. David Thomas, the 5008 PIRTES surgeon, recalled that the medics were each given a canteen of alcohol to use for sterilization purposes when they got to Normandy. He dryly remarked, "I doubt that a drop of it ever got out of England." Company commanders marched their men on the roads. This gave them some exercise and helped relieve the boredom or ease the tension. It also gave them some sense of the scope of the enterprise and a sense of confidence that a fighting force of such immensity could not be denied. Marching through the countryside and small villages, they saw unbelievable amounts of equipment and uncountable numbers of aircraft. They saw the might of the free world gathered to destroy the Nazis. Men in the uniforms of New Zealand, Norway, Poland, France, Australia, Canada, Britain, Holland, Belgium, and the United States. A Sergeant Slaughter recalled soldiers from every Allied nation being everywhere. Some of the resentment felt by the Tommies toward the Yanks came out. Corporal Masters remembered marching with 3 Troop past an American unit also out marching. A couple of Yanks had stopped to chat with a mother and her 3-year-old daughter. All communication with civilians was strictly forbidden, but done anyway. Almost surely the little girl was asking the question all children in Britain had long since learned to ask of the GIs. "Got any gum, chum?" But as we marched past, Masters said, a disgusted voice at the back of our lot growled at the Americans, "At least you could let them grow up." Among the millions of men gathered in southern England to participate in the invasion of France, only a handful knew the secrets of Overlord, where the assault would go ashore and when. Those few had a super-security designation, above top secret, called bigot. They were said to be bigoted. Slowly, the circle of those in the know widened. Schaeff and 21st Army Group staff officers briefed Army and Corps staffs, who in turn briefed division and regimental commanders, right on down to company and platoon officers, who passed the information on to their non-coms and privates. At the lower levels, the place names were not revealed until the men were actually sailing for France. Otherwise, the briefings were extraordinarily detailed and accurate with regard to terrain features, fairly realistic about the numbers and quality of the German defenders, and wildly optimistic about what the naval and air bombardments were going to do to those defenders. The briefings were done on sand tables, or in the case of the 12th Regiment, 4th Division, on a huge sponge-rubber replica of the Cotentin Peninsula, made to scale both horizontally and vertically, complete in minute detail with roads, bridges, buildings, power lines, hedgerows, fortifications, and obstacles. One member of the 12th recalled, "It was as though the men had been suddenly transported by plane and were looking down on the very beaches they would soon land on and the very ground over which they would have to fight." Officers were briefed at regimental level. Lieutenant Ralph Eastridge of the 115th Regiment, 29th Division, wrote an account of the briefing he attended. The briefing officer, the regimental S2, began with a map of Omaha Beach. He explained that the 16th, 1st Division, and 116th, 29th Division would land side by side. The 115th would follow the 116th. He described the beach obstacles and fixed fortifications at Omaha, the terrain, including the distance from the sea wall to the foot of the bluff, about 200 metres, the height of the bluff, 30 metres on average, and other details. You can see that the defences are heaviest at these points, where the little valleys lead inland. These breaks, or draws, in the bluff are our beach exits, and the key to success in the initial assault will be securing these exits. The defences include minefields, barbed wire, anti-tank ditches, and interlocking bands of automatic fire concentrated at the exits. Each of these positions is manned by an estimated battalion, with another battalion strung along the bluff between. They are part of the 916th Division, a static division, so called because it is designed to fight in place from fixed positions. This particular static division is made up of about 40% Germans, many of them partially disabled. But remember, a one-armed soldier is just as capable of pulling the trigger of a fixed machine gun in a pillbox as a two-armed soldier. The remaining 60% of the division is made up of mercenaries, largely Russian, with some Poles, Yugoslavs, Slavs, and other Balkans. They are rough, simple, ignorant men, and have little concern for the value of life. They come from a part of the world where fighting has been the main occupation for generations. Their officers and non-coms are German. They will fight to the death. Behind this static division are mobile divisions, first-line troops. Personnel is largely German, and most have seen combat on the Russian or Italian fronts. Their weakness is a lack of transport. Now for the plan in detail. The 16th and 116th will hit the beach in assault craft at about 0630. The boats will ground out around the first of the underwater obstacles on a rising tide. The immediate objective will be to secure the high ground above the beaches, denying the Germans direct fire and observation of the beach. Our regiment will land at H plus 90 minutes, move immediately to this village, indicating Saint-Laurent on the map but unnamed, and go into position on the right. This first part is a comparatively easy job. The tough job will be done by the 116th before we land. If the 116th goes in right, we should have a pushover. "Sir," one officer asked, "what happens if the 116th doesn't clean up the beach on schedule?" "Then we take over their mission." "How many divisions in the first wave?" another officer asked. "It'll be a big show," the S2 answered with a smile. "Believe me, but we need only concern ourselves with our little sector." "When is D-Day?" "Don't know yet. About the 3rd or 4th of June would be a guess." The officers of the 115th liked that pushover talk, but did not believe it. "The prospects looked grim," Lieutenant Eastridge commented. The diagrams of the beach defences indicated that the Germans had been fantastically thorough. The 116th had a rugged job ahead, indeed. Felix Branham of the 116th heard his briefer tell his platoon that if the men got the excess equipment they would be carrying to the beach, mortar rounds, landmines, ammo boxes, radios and batteries and more, they would be making a contribution. The 115th, coming in behind, would not be as heavily laden, and their men would come in and pick up what we had carried ashore, and they would do the job, even though they had to walk over our dead bodies. Such bloodthirsty realism was uncommon. Most of the officers were upbeat and reassuring when they briefed their companies and platoons. 40 years and more later, veterans of Omaha still recalled with some bitterness what they were told. The briefer explained that it would be no problem at all because the Air Force was coming over in great numbers. The Navy bombardment would be tremendous. The rocket ships would fire thousands of rockets. It was going to be a walkover, nothing to worry about. Our worries would come 2 or 3 days later when the Panzer counterattacks began. 149th Combat Engineers. We were told that many thousands of tons of bombs would be dropped on our beach by the 9th Air Force just prior to the invasion. My concern was that we would have trouble getting our trucks across the beach because the bomb craters would be so close and so deep. 6th ESB. Our briefing officer gave us a pep talk. More than 1,000 bombers would do their work beforehand. The battleships would blow everything off the map: pillboxes, artillery, mortars, and the barbed wire entanglements. Everything would be blasted to smithereens. A pushover. 26th Regiment. We were briefed to believe that there would be no living things on the beach, no life of any kind. It would be a piece of cake. 5th ESB. Almost every unit scheduled to invade had a similar experience. To drive home the point, junior officers, non-coms and privates were encouraged to study the sand tables or replicas whenever they wished. Thousands spent countless hours looking, discussing, and familiarizing themselves with their objectives. They also received photographs, some only a few hours old, that revealed the most recent progress in the building of the Atlantic Wall. With that much accurate intelligence, how could the Germans stand a chance? There was tough guy talk. The briefer for the 91st Troop Carrier Squadron glider-tugging pilots gave out a warning. Pilots will release when the C-47 leading the formation starts a gradual turn to the left to return to the coast. If any C-47 pilot cuts his glider off too soon, he'd better keep on going, because if he comes back here, I'll be waiting for him. One of the glider pilots had a question. In an entirely innocent manner he asked, "Sir, what do we do after we land our gliders?" The briefer was taken aback. After a silence, he confessed, "I don't know. I guess we really never thought of that." There was nervous laughter when the glider pilot sitting next to Sergeant Charles Skidmore gave his own answer. "Run like hell." The Army, being the Army, inevitably had some jackasses around. Sergeant Alan Anderson of the 116th Regiment remembered being called into a tent where some colonel from public relations made an impassioned and patriotic speech about what a privilege it was for them to have this opportunity to be in this great invasion, which would change the history of the world. At the end of his speech, he made the remarkable announcement that he was sorry he couldn't go with them. My buddy, Harry Markham, poked me and said, "Well, he can have my place if he really wants to go." The PR colonel went on to say that the Army was ready to take nearly 100% casualties in the first 24 hours. Anderson remembered, "We all turned around and looked at each other and said, 'Well, it's tough that you have to go.'" Once briefed, the troops were sealed in tight. MPs roamed the grounds and perimeter, no one allowed in without proper identification, no one allowed out without proper orders. Captain Cyril Henry, a British tanker, recalled that his father died on June 1st and was buried on June 3rd, but, "I wasn't allowed to go to the funeral, I just wasn't allowed, but my brother in the army, who was stationed in Damascus, was allowed to fly home for the funeral." Bravado comes easy to young men who think of themselves as indestructible, but the briefings and the detailed study of the beach defences had a sobering effect on even the most light-hearted, unreflective soldiers. For all that they told each other, nothing could be worse than the training regimen, they had some sense of what bullets and shrapnel can do to a human body. For the most part, they had not been in combat, but they had been reading or seeing war news ever since September 1939, in their hometown newspapers or at the newsreels at the movie theatres. They had followed the sweep of the Wehrmacht across Europe, watched it defeat the best the Poles, Norwegians, Belgians, British, French, Yugoslavs, Greeks and Russians could put against it. The men of the AE realized that the Wehrmacht was a thoroughly combat-experienced army that had once been unstoppable and might now be impregnable. As a consequence of these realizations, after the briefings, the chaplain did a big business. After losing his $2,500, Dutch Schultz went to confession. The priest, a British chaplain, really chewed him out about some of the sins he confessed involving the Sixth Commandment. Schultz went to Mass every chance he had. I should mention that it was a very inspiring sight to me to see Captain Steff, Major Kellum, Major McGinty, and other battalion officers serving as altar boys. Major Thomas of the 5008 didn't pay much attention at his briefing. I had been in the airborne long enough to know that night jumps never went off as planned. Afterward, he got into a poker game. He was losing, so he thought, I better go and listen to the chaplain so as to touch all the bases.